Okay, thank you very much, Margie, and good afternoon to the participants for this particular breakout topic entitled the Skills Framework Paradigm in the Case of the Information Technology Industry in the Philippines. I'm Chippy Buenafe, and I'm actually the current chair of the Department of Information Science and Technology of the University of Asia and the Pacific. And prior to my academic life, in the past 7 to 8 years, I've been involved in the IT industry, mainly doing senior management and leadership work towards the tail end of my career there. And I want to set expectations at the start in the sense that we have like almost 2 hours now for this particular topic. And if I were to allocate perhaps a few minutes for questions and me answering those questions, I suspect that the maximum time that I'll probably have would be around an hour 15. But nevertheless, I don't want to present this as if this were like another lecture or this were like a typical presentation in a technical conference. I don't think that's the purpose. But I do hope that at the end of this session, I would have tickled your minds a bit, made you a bit more curious as to what this skills framework is about and how we can actually use it in our specific circumstances, with me using information technology as an example for that. Okay. Now, this is not going to be very comprehensive. A lot of the things that I will present would be, well, what we'd say in progress, right? Something that is still under investigation, under study. But I do hope that I can provide you with more or less the cutting edge or what's really currently available in the literature or in the field today. Okay. Now for that, this is just our journey this afternoon. So I'll talk about the challenges that we faced when it comes to skills mismatch, okay, and how we try to address that skills mismatch, and then followed by a section on our attempts to actually solve this skills mismatch problem. And towards the end of this presentation, I'll be talking about the specific case of the ICT industry and how we've tried to tackle this issue. So overall, the title might be long, but if you were to shorten it or get a very quick takeaway from today's session, it's about skills mismatch as a problem and how we try to address the skills mismatch problem through the lens of information technology, okay, or specifically through the sector of the ICT. Okay, so it's not going to be like a panacea or like a universal medicine to the problem of skills mismatch, but hopefully this would give you some idea of the difficulties, no, and the complexity inherent when we try to solve this problem. Okay, and hopefully we'd be, well, at least for me personally, we'd be a bit more respectful with the people involved and how we try to actually solve the issues at hand. Okay, but I don't want to burst the bubble here just yet. Okay, so I'm just gonna provide you with some background, and then we'll go with the specific details around this. So first up, what's the challenge? Okay, skills mismatch is a challenge. It's not a new challenge. In fact, perhaps for centuries, you can probably consider skills mismatch as something that has been in existence, but we've never given it the language or the vocabulary to address it as a skills mismatch. So, what are the challenges involved with respect to the skills mismatch problem? Well, basically, you can look at it as one of six possible reasons or sources for the skills mismatch. Now, I understand that the categorization here might seem that this is exhaustive or this is like your complete set. That's not the case. What I'm sharing right now is what the current literature on the study of the skills mismatch would currently have as possible sources of skills mismatch. And what are they? Well, we have 6. One is overeducation or undereducation. The second one is overskilling or underskilling. The third one is horizontal mismatch. The fourth one is on skill obsolescence. The fifth one, skills gaps. And lastly, skills shortage. We'll go into each one in a while. For overeducation or undereducation, the mismatch is actually at the level or degree of qualifications that a person would have versus what a company is looking for. Okay? So it's at the level or degree of qualifications. You have the qualifications, but it's either you lack certain things or it's quite a lot that we don't really need everything as far as your qualifications go. What might be some good examples? Well, for example, hiring a person with a graduate degree, either a master's degree or a doctorate degree, for a role that does not require a graduate degree. And this is quite common. We have a lot of roles or vacancies that if you look at the minimum qualifications of these vacancies, they're not really master's degree or doctorate degree required, right? A bachelor's degree would be sufficient. And yet, you'd have people who would be applying for those roles that would have these qualifications. In those cases, that person is actually overeducated for the role. Now, another example would be if you have a medical student doing work that is expected to be done, okay, by a licensed medical doctor. Okay, among other things, you can probably think of examples like giving out vaccines or extracting blood, or even making authoritative triages or immediate diagnosis of certain cases. While in practice, that is something that's doable, generally a medical student would be undereducated, okay, for the role that's required. Okay. So you have those instances or circumstances wherein the skills mismatch is really at the level of overeducation or undereducation. Now, what about the second mismatch type, overskilling or underskilling? Well, here, this is a mismatch in specific competencies, but it is usually based on one's own perception of how much skill this person would have. Okay, so this is more like a self-reflective realization that, okay, I have too much of these skills, or I lack a lot of skills. Okay, what might be a good example here? Well, a person with experience in office administration was hired to do events management. Now, office administration, or in perhaps a more reductionist view, like your typical admin assistants, they do paperwork, they run the office, do things very, very well, but you can probably get that person, that same admin assistant, to do projects or to organize events, running logistics, coordinating with people. Okay. Now, it's possible that your admin assistant may not have the necessary skills, for example, to deal with vendors, to deal with other colleagues, okay, or deal with external parties. Okay. In that case, you'll have a situation wherein it's underskilling. Okay. But sometimes you probably have someone, you can do a flip side of it, a person with experience doing project management, for example, was hired to do a role that is simply office administration. Okay? So in that sense, you have a case wherein it's overskilling. Okay? Someone who can really do a lot of things, okay, and even more, but that person was just simply hired for the purposes of office administration. Now take note, in this case, we can make the assumption that that person has the minimum qualifications, academic qualifications. So in this case, it's not an issue of overeducation or undereducation, but really more about overskilling or underskilling. Now, what about the next type of skills mismatch? You have what is known as horizontal mismatch. In this case, there is a mismatch in the quality of qualifications. Typically, hiring someone with a qualification that is not related to the field that is really required by the role. What's a good example here? Well, for example, you'd want to hire a business administration graduate to do IT support work. Now, this is quite intriguing or quite interesting because we see this actually in the industry. Sometimes they would require, as one of requirements, minimum requirements, perhaps that they have a bachelor's degree, but the work that they'll do, okay, is very much IT. But a lot of companies would just settle for graduates that do not have formal education in IT. Nothing wrong with that per se, but then you might want to rethink what are really the needed minimum qualifications for this role. Probably you do not need to have someone with formal IT education. Okay, so, but in that sense, you have a situation with what is known as horizontal mismatch. Now, the fourth type is skill obsolescence. So the original skill is no longer a requirement, and this is something that is quite prevalent in industries that keep on evolving very quickly, such as the ICT sector. Okay. Now, what might be a perfect example or a good example for this mismatch? Well, before, if the role only required typing skills, for those of you perhaps in my age group, you'd probably have experienced working with typewriters. Well, the funny thing about typewriters is that they don't need any electricity. So in the case of blackouts or power outages, I'm sure the typewriter will work. But then again, back in those days, typing skills were important, were required for the work to be done. Okay, but this time around, it has evolved into something else. You don't really need to have typing skills called out as required skills, but maybe this time around, you'll be required to do word processing skills because of the advent of tools, so technological tools that enable to do more things than just simple typing. Okay, so, and you can expand that further, probably learning how to lay out, okay, and maybe as complicated or as esoteric as having some design, okay, having that look and feel, you know, that is quite artistic in the multimedia realm. And all of that just really started perhaps from typing skills. So this is also a good example of a skills mismatch in relation to skills obsolescence. Okay. And normally this is something that is prevalent for the older set of labor or talent that you see in the market, especially if they're not really that robust in terms of trying to reskill themselves or learning new skills in order for them to be qualified for those roles. Now, another common skills mismatch, okay, and this seems to be like a catch-all for everything else, is the aspect of skills gaps. Very simple term, but what does it really mean? Well, it's a mismatch in specific competencies, but it is usually based on the employer's perception of what the gap is. Earlier, in the overskilling or underskilling, that is the self-perception of the talent. Skills gap, this is the perception of the employer. Now, what might be a good example for this? For example, you have a very good individual contributor, very strong technically, but that person, because he or she would have been a high flyer doing performance, above and beyond, and this person would be primed to be promoted to lead a team, perhaps a size of 25. But that person doesn't have leadership or management experience. He or she would be very, very good technically, but that person has no experience leading teams, okay, or managing them or supervising them. Okay. In this case, you have a situation wherein the talent has a skill gap. Okay. And that happens. And sometimes you might be curious as to why people go through this. Now, we'll talk more about that in a while, but this happens. Okay? In the end, sometimes you just have to accept the gap, but there is a gap, nevertheless. And lastly, this is a little bit more 10,000-foot view, in terms of the skills shortage, because this is a mismatch in supply meeting demand. Okay? You don't have a lot of supply to meet the current demand. And usually this happens in the face of a spike in the demand, normally triggered by certain situations. Now, what would be a good example here? Well, back in the days, early 2000s, you had developed countries in need of nurses or caregivers. Okay. Now, that is an example of skill shortage. Whatever available supply that they have in their own countries, that wouldn't be enough to meet the demands of the nurses. Even if you try to increase their wages, increasing their wages won't really meet the demand. Okay, normal economic analysis will tell you that, okay, if there is a shortage, then maybe you just raise the price, in this case wages, and hopefully the market will clear. Well, that's not usually the case. Even if you really try to raise the wages, the fundamental reality is that you don't have that many people, okay, to actually meet that demand. And that's an example also of a skills mismatch, but perhaps in a much larger view of things, right? Rather than looking at it from a micro level, skills shortage would be at a macro level. Now, these are 6 categories or 6 types of skills mismatch. Now, we go on to the next section of this presentation on the attempt. How are we trying to solve the skills mismatch problem? Okay, and I'd probably start with the idea of 2 schools of thought. Okay, 2 schools of thought. I mean, in a way, I don't know if you detected the pun behind it, schools of thought, but you'll see in a while why I chose that term. So there are 2 schools of thought. The first is the regulatory approach. In the Philippines, we have this principle known as the principle of trifocalization, wherein education is actually trifocalized or distributed into 3 regulators. The first one would be for basic education, which would be on the Department of Education, or DepEd. Second would be for higher education. In this case, it's the Commission on Higher Education, or CHED. And lastly, the third stream would be for middle-level education. This would be under the purview of the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority, or TESDA. Okay. So these 3 regulators, they work hand in hand to actually help regulate the entire education sector in the Philippines. Okay, and that's the principle of trifocalization. Okay, now just a little bit of historical background behind it for those of you who would still remember. Back then, the regulation for education was just one entity, which was the Department of Education, Culture, and Sports. So even higher education was part of that. Now, during the time in the 90s or late 80s, there was this movement to actually give more focus on the specific areas: basic education, higher education, and middle-level education, or more popularly known as technical vocational education. So, and then they made that split, wherein you've had these 3 agencies coming off from that idea. That's one school of thought, the regulatory approach. Now, another school of thought in trying to solve the skills mismatch problem is something that I would probably call the free market approach. And in this case, you have a lot of competency models that are used by companies to actually determine the skills needed by that organization, and would even include pathways, would even include interventions that could help solve whatever mismatch that might be detected from that. Okay, so so I'll go on with each one. So I'll probably start off with let's see now. I'll probably start off with the first one. Okay. Let me go back. Start with the Department of Education. You've probably recalled in more recent history that basic education was bumped up or improved from 10 years to 12 years. So in this sense, the critical period is actually grade 11 and grade 12. Now, with senior high school, grade 11, grade 12, this is all predominantly academic track programs. Okay, they're meant to prepare students for that. Okay. Okay. So that's the first one. Now, unfortunately, academic track programs were meant to prepare students for higher education, not necessarily for immediate employability. That's really the premise behind academic track programs. They're there to facilitate the student to actually have perhaps a career in higher education, or not necessarily a career in higher education, but a career that would really require higher education qualifications. And in this regard, technical vocational livelihood programs, or TVL programs, are underappreciated. Okay? Just to let you know, DepEd would have these programs available, but they're not as widely implemented as the academic track programs. Of course, there are other tracks in today's system, DepEd system. You have your sports track program. So there are students that go through this program that are really meant to be focused on performance, in terms of sports, right? In order to compete and represent the country. Okay, and you even have tracks that are in the realm of arts. Okay, so for performative arts or visual arts, okay, fine arts, this would probably fall under that track. But really, the focus here is that I'd like to point out that predominantly a lot of the programs that you have for grade 11, grade 12 are academic track programs and not TVL tracks. Okay. Now, second regulator here would be in relation to CHED. And they're regulated by what is known as Policy Standards and Guidelines, or PSGs. For those of you in the CHED world, you'd probably be heard of this very often. Unfortunately, or perhaps depending on your view, fortunately, the updating process can be tedious. It's so tedious because the PSGs would require updating, okay, because this is your basis for colleges and universities to operate. Okay, any deviation from the PSG, you are actually prone or liable for penalties. Now, when PSGs need updating, higher education institutions also need to update their curriculum and plan of study. Okay, they might also need to update their faculty. And in some cases, they probably need to update their facilities, okay, their laboratories, their equipment. Okay. So whenever these PSGs get updated, and if ever there's a need to update it, there's a lot of tasks to be done in order to ensure that things are up to date as far as the PSGs go. Now, I want you to hold that thought for a while. We'll talk about that in the case of the IT or the ICT case in the Philippines later, the latter portion of this presentation. Now, for TESDA, the regulation is pretty much defined by their training regulations, or TRs, which typically leads to an NC, or national certificates. Now, the idea of these national certificates, these are official papers, right? That any person with these papers, they can actually be involved in work that these papers tell you to do, okay? Perhaps I wouldn't need to go far for a lot of the mechanical and electrical work, a lot of these things, they're regulated by TESDA. It would be good for everyone's safety that whoever does your mechanical work, perhaps your automotive repairs or your electrical repairs at home, would have that certificate that says that they're actually qualified to do those types of jobs. Okay. Another term for the national certificates, the more basic term would be qualifications. Okay. And this would allow them to engage in trade, okay, for those specific types of tasks. Now, it's highly granular. If you've had an opportunity to take a look at the training regulations of TESDA, they're quite detailed. And it's nice, it's quite detailed. A typical training regulation, just to give an example, for programming in Java, you'd probably have a lot of pages for that, around 40 pages. That simply defines what's really required for someone who can be qualified to do programming in Java. Quite funny because these things you can probably get online, a lot of them for free. But the only advantage here is that someone with a certificate in programming in Java is said to be stamped by the government to say that, okay, this person knows his stuff, okay? If ever he or she would actually engage in that type of trade, you can be safe, okay? Okay, you can feel assured that this person is competent. And as such, the details behind how to train someone for those specific qualifications, they can be quite detailed or highly granular. But a lot of these TRs, okay, are actually for lower level technical skills. Career progression is unclear in these situations because we look at technical skills or qualifications, technical qualifications, as if they're isolated, right? In some cases, there are certain training courses that could lead to further advanced training courses. That's usually possible. But a big majority of the courses in TESDA, they're pretty much standalone. You take that, okay, the NC level would be determined based on the skill set that is contained in the qualification, and that's pretty much it. Okay, so in terms of the career progression, it's quite unclear. But what they can tell you, or what TESDA ensures, that okay, as far as the skills go, the technical skills go, it's there. So things in relation to business or management, which nowadays can be considered as professions in themselves, okay, it's not quite clear how we can really qualify a manager, for example. Of course, there are alternatives, there are equivalents, let's say in government, wherein you have the Civil Service Commission, okay, being able to dictate qualifications for a career executive, just to give an example. But this is perhaps limited to government service. Okay, what about the private sector? Okay, and normally for private sector, the most immediate proxy for these things would be people with advanced degrees like MBAs. But going back to TESDA, the regulation that they define here, it's very granular, but it's really for purely technical skills, typically at the lower level. Okay. Now, we move away from the regulatory school of thought to the free market school of thought, and we'll talk about competency models. Now, I'm not going to detail specific competency models here, no, but needless to say, you can categorize competency models according to three general types, right? The first one would be company-specific competency models, especially with companies that are quite mature. And normally we'd see this in multinational corporations, okay, that they have their own competency models, quite rigorous. The career path is quite plotted out very well. And it's actually linked to performance management, which also leads to certain compensation and benefits as a result. Okay. Now, the most obvious limitation for that is it's only specific for that company. True, if one tries to copy it, it might be applicable. On the other hand, there are certain things in those competency models that might be considered as trade secret. Okay. So it's not that easy to really share company-specific competency models. Now, a way around it is to have industry-specific competency models, wherein you have people coming from the same industry or companies coming from the same industry to band together to form industry associations. And through the industry associations, you can come up with your specific competency models. Okay, this is not new. In fact, the concept of guilds centuries ago would fall into this situation, would fall into this category. Okay, but nevertheless, the act of banding together, coordinating, sharing notes, and then establishing within your industry that this is the competency model, that is something that has been done in the past, and that is something that's also being done right now. In fact, you can probably look at this, for example, in medicine, right? Wherein perhaps the initial license to practice medicine is there, but for you to move up, let's say becoming a specialist or a fellow, okay, in these things, they have their own associations that really determine whether that person is actually qualified to be like the fellow of a radiology department or a fellow in cardiology. Okay, so they have this self-regulatory exercise. okay, that defines that. But a lot of it is based on the association, based on that collective of people that would make that determination whether this person is actually qualified for a higher level. But the mechanics is the same. Okay? And lastly, you could have competency models that would cut across many industries, or horizontal competency models. Now, this would perhaps pertain to a lot of the competency models, as an example, management leadership, wherein it is not really going to be specific for just one industry. There are certain skills that can be used across industries. Okay. But even then, I mean, it sort of begs the question, right? Because in certain industries, the requirements to become a leader in that industry would sometimes have certain elements that you also know what the industry is about. Okay. But there have been cases wherein leaders are able to hop from one industry to another. And in all of those cases, that person has been successful. So the argument that that person would really need industry knowledge, okay, I mean, it's not entirely true, or it's not entirely an absolute requirement. Okay. Now, I want to touch a little bit on the Philippines skills framework, because this is an attempt to try to resolve the gaps or the spaces in between the efforts of the private sector or of the industry to actually come up with their own competency models. Okay, you can search this online, and right now DTI is the one on top of it. So this is like the homepage of their skills framework, and it tries to actually codify the competency model, okay, that can be used by everyone. Okay. Now, does this have a regulatory feel? Not at the present moment, okay? But it's a good guide. Okay? And later on, I'll talk a little bit about this, but to preempt something here, the PSF is not yet completely done. Okay, it's starting. So it's just started, and what you can see on the screen, there are only like 6 sectors for now. IT as IT hasn't been encoded yet. And we'll talk more about it, because that is something that in the grapevine, as I would say, this is something that the ICT is also trying to put some effort in doing. And this is me getting information also from DTI on what they've told me about it when they were trying to promote the PSF. Okay. But one thing interesting about the skills framework is that we're not the only ones who are actually doing skills framework in the Philippines. Okay, and one good example that I'd like to pick because this is probably a basis for our own PSF is the existence of other frameworks. Okay, in other countries. But before I go that, okay, I was preempting myself. What's nice about the Philippine Skills Framework is that it would have these 2 things encoded in your skills framework. You have what is known as functional skills and competencies, or perhaps in our parlance, the hard skills, right? The skills that would really determine your employability, or the skills that would determine if you get paid, hard skills. And then the second category would be enabling skills and competencies, or the softer skills, or the human skills. Now, notice that these 2 categories, these 2 sections are present in the PSF, the Philippine Skills Framework. But when we go to the other skills framework of other countries, for example, in the case of Singapore, you have the Singapore Skills Framework developed by Skills Future, the agency of the Singaporean government. What you'll notice is that they also have their equivalent of hard and soft skills. The terminology that they use is technical skills and competencies. And for the soft skills, it's generic skills and competencies, which I think they revised it to critical core skills. Now, notice that the idea, the principles behind the skills framework across countries, at least in this case, these 2 countries, they're the same. They want to be able to codify the hard skills. They want to be able to codify the soft skills, package them together. This is the specific role, the specific occupation for this country, for example. And these are the requirements for that. These are the expectations of that role. At what level they should have this skill 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Now, again, I said at the start of the presentation, it's not going to be super comprehensive. This is not a lecture of sorts, but this is just hopefully just to whet your appetite, really, on to see how we in the Philippines try to resolve the skills mismatch problem. Now, I want to dive right in to the ICT sector and our way of trying to solve the skills mismatch problem. Now, I'll start off with the regulatory school of thought. Okay, let's go with DepEd. It might be interesting for people to know that DepEd, as I said, it's predominantly academic track, but they do have the TechVoc livelihood track. And under that track, you have 4 strands. You have agri-fishery, you have industrial arts, home economics, and ICT. So DepEd recognizes the fact that ICT is actually its own strand. Okay, so it does require attention, and DepEd is acknowledging that. Okay, that yes, ICT is an important skill that if we can train these people right away, they can be employable. Right. But under the ICT strand in DepEd, they recognize 12 specializations. Now take note that in senior high school, when they do these specializations, they typically just choose one. And that's it. Okay. At the end of their grade 12, when they graduate grade 12, they typically get an equivalent national certificate for the specialization they find themselves in. Now, these are the 12 specializations recognized by DepEd. Now, predominantly, okay, in the earlier stages of the K-12 transition, you've seen a lot of computer systems servicing as their TVL ICT specialization for that school. Okay. And you go anywhere, you go in whatever provinces. I mean, I've gone around to see the TVL implementation in DepEd, and more often than not, they'd focus on computer systems servicing, the one in red, you know, in red text, in bold red text. Now, another realization that I found out is that you have these 12 specializations. At the start of the K-12 implementation, people are working to do CSS. So you have a lot of senior high schools doing CSS, but really there's a good opportunity area to focus also on computer programming. Okay. And the fact that DepEd has defined curriculum guides for these 3 specializations, these 3 would actually be a good alternative specializations in the ICT strand. Now, the reason why I'm promoting or suggesting these 3 is because compared to the other specializations, these 3 would perhaps require the least amount of equipment or capital requirement to actually proceed with the specialization. In this case, you just need to have, at a minimum, a laptop or a desktop that can run either .NET or Java. Okay. Perhaps for an Oracle database, it's a little bit nuanced. Okay. You probably need to have a little bit higher specs for that. But still, when you compare it, let's say with animation or with broadband installation, okay, I mean it's not really something that any typical DepEd public school can probably afford. Okay. So that's the nature of, or how the lay of the land is for DepEd. Now, diving into those 4 specializations I've talked about, you see that CSS would require 640 hours to complete that specialization, and normally this would be covered from grade 9 to grade 12. But for the 3 programming courses or specializations that I pointed out earlier, you've noticed that the requirement is only half of CSS, and this is something that you can immediately insert in grade 11 or grade 12. In other words, if a school that has senior high school that would probably have a computer lab that is doing fine, no, it's not, we've gone around also helping rehabilitate computer labs in a lot of the public schools. But assuming that you have good laboratories, this is something that can be done with at least some of the equipment or the available equipment that the public schools might have. And you only need to impact grade 11, grade 12. Okay, so that's possible. Now, where I'm involved in some of the researches that I've involved in, we've started to help train DepEd school teachers in eventually offering these courses or these specializations for their senior high school students. Okay, but it's still in the early phases. We're still trying to build traction. One of the challenges that you see in trying to get people trained here is that they have to be confident in actually being able to train it, not to mention that they also have to be qualified to train it. So it's as if they have to go through a TESDA course, okay, get their national certificate so that they can actually teach these courses in senior high school. Okay, but okay, the point here is that okay, DepEd does allow the possibility to actually insert these things in the current education framework for basic education at least. Now we go to TESDA. Now in TESDA's world, there are 25 sectors, okay, 25 fields of industries here. And in the ICT sector, okay, there are 19 qualifications or 19 training courses, if you may. And these would be the 19 courses, okay, quite detailed. You can probably get this from the TESDA website, okay. And notice that if you look at the dates, the rightmost side, these would be the dates when the training regulations were promulgated. Okay, and you've noticed that a lot of these courses have been there like for almost 20 years, really. Okay, some of them might need updating, but the fact of the matter is that the idea, the concept of coming up with a competency map or skills framework, okay, by TESDA is something that they've already thought of. Okay, now I've noticed that you probably might pick up some names or descriptive titles that seem to be the same from DepEd. Well, later on when we map them, you will see that they're actually the same. Now, on your first column, you have the TVL specializations in ICT by DepEd. You have the equivalent training courses from TESDA. Now, notice that there is quite some discrepancy as far as the required hours is concerned. For DepEd, they're typically fewer than the ones in TESDA, with the exception of a few things like CSS, computer system servicing, okay, or contact center services, okay, or illustration. They'd probably have more than what TESDA would require. But everything else, okay, you'd notice that TESDA would really require more from the student or from the participant. Now, I'd like to point out a few things here. First, the ones highlighted in gray, which includes computer system servicing, guess what? TESDA is recognizing them not as of the ICT sector, but from a different sector. So as far as computer system servicing is concerned, that is not part of the ICT sector. That is part of the electrical sector, for example. Or in the case of technical drafting, I believe this is part of the construction sector because you do need to do drafting work, okay, for that. And yet, okay, they can also be considered as ICT because of the tools required to actually do these things, right? Of course, back in the old days, when you do drafting, you don't really need tools to do drafting, right? But now you have computer-aided design tools that actually help you do drafting. So they're sort of considered as ICT then. Now, take a look also at CSS. Here you can see that there is a very glaring discrepancy here as far as the number of hours go. DepEd requires more for CSS rather than TESDA. And it's quite funny because if you do the math, it's huge. It's more than twice the number of hours. And if you recall from the earlier slides, in order for DepEd to implement the computer system servicing specialization, they would have to start as early as grade 9, okay, instead of grade 11. Now, looking at the other 3 suggested specializations I mentioned earlier, you'll notice that, okay, they're sort of a little bit higher or lower, okay, as the case may be, but they're not that far off. Okay. In fact, the discrepancies can be explained because of certain things that may or may not be needed in tackling it at the basic education level, or they could have been tackled in other subjects in the other grade levels. Okay? But the discrepancy is not that big. And typically the discrepancy can also be explained by work immersion. Okay, work immersion is the term for internship for basic education. So students would take around 80 hours of work of internship. Okay, and they do something there, right? So, well, if they do work immersion, okay, that actually adds on to the required number of hours. That's why the discrepancies can be explained. Okay, but you probably have noticed 12 TVL specializations, 19 specializations from TESDA, and you even have specializations that are not considered in the ICT sector. So what happened to the rest? Well, these orphaned TESDA courses, if you will, they're not really orphaned, but they don't have a matching DepEd TVL specialization. Okay. Now, one thing that you can take a look is that the number of hours required by TESDA, it's a lot. Okay, and this is something that if you were to apply it at the basic education level, you probably would have to start as early as what, grade 5 or grade 6. And from an educational standpoint, that's not going to be very productive because these students are still growing, they're still part of their formative years. Okay, so definitely there are certain things that cannot be omitted as a compromise to actually have these training courses implemented. Okay, so the sheer number of hours made it presumably the reason why DepEd will not consider having to have their own TVL specialization equivalent for these TESDA courses. But those highlighted in yellow, later on you'll see that they actually have equivalents in the higher education level, basically degree programs. And these would be courses in those degree programs. So in a certain sense, TESDA, with the term middle level education, they're really literally straddling in the middle as far as ICT sector goes, right? They have certain skills, they have certain qualifications that can be delivered at the lower level of education, specifically in basic education, grade 9, grade 10, grade 11, grade 12, and they would have training courses that are typically found at the higher education level. Okay. So now let's try to deep dive into the higher education space, this other regulator, the third of the trifocalization, which is the Commission on Higher Education. When it comes to IT, the ultimate regulatory benchmark that all colleges and universities would have to follow would be the 2015 guideline, okay, number 25, okay, and this is a very long title, but that is the reference, okay. All colleges, all universities, if you are delivering degree programs in IT, computer science, or information systems, you have to follow this standard. Now, perhaps the first thing that comes to your mind would be the standard is quite dated. Okay, it's like 8 years old, right? And there have been talks that this is under updating, okay? But the typical process whenever you update it, okay, normally there will be a lot of stakeholder consultations and the likes. Frankly, we've not seen any movement in those areas yet. But okay, to be fair to them, they say that they're already updating it. But it's quite funny. It's a 2015 version. And take note, 2015, this was before the implementation of the K-12 program. Now, K-12 has already been foreseen as early as 2010, 2011, 2012. Okay, so if you've noticed the regulation for 2015, okay, they've already tried to apply the K-12 ideas here, but not exactly, okay? Because at this point, people weren't really sure whether to push through with it or not. Okay, but that's another discussion for another day. Now, what's important in this standard is that it is actually based by the recommendations of perhaps the top association of computing professionals in the world, which is the ACM, or the Association for Computing Machinery. Okay, but even their computing curricular recommendations, they're quite a bit dated. Their latest report would have been in 2020. I'm not exactly sure if this was before the pandemic or just immediately after the start of the pandemic. But 3 years running now, there hasn't been any updates for that. And that's just a snapshot report, 2020. The curriculum recommendations are actually much earlier. Okay? In fact, if you take a look at the 2015 guidelines by CHED, they are actually making reference to the 2008 recommendation by ACM. So you can probably take a hazard there. It's like 15 years, right? 15-year-old reference. Now, just to give you an idea, these would be the number of units. This is minimum. Other universities would probably have more, depending on the mandate or the mission and vision of the institution, but this is what CHED would require, 146 units for each of the programs. Okay. And these are the 6 courses that are common to the 3 computing programs. Okay. So if you've noticed, introduction to computing, computer programming, algorithms, data structures, information management, this would be databases, and lastly, web development, okay, emerging technologies, this would be the last course listed below. All of them are 3 units each. Now, you do have other similar programs, like the multimedia program based in 2017, which would have the PSGs for the multimedia arts program, and you have multimedia computing, or in a shorter form, we call them the EMC program, or the Entertainment and Multimedia Computing Program, which was also released in 2014. Now, take note that these 2 PSGs, these are your initial PSGs. The one in IT education for 2015 is a revised PSG. So in other words, there was an even older PSG for that, which has been superseded by the 2015 version. If I'm not mistaken, it's the 2006 version, but I don't want to bore you with the details. These are initial PSGs. So in other words, they haven't been updated yet since they were released. So for multimedia computing, okay, so you have this 167 units, a little bit more than what you typically get from any of the computing programs, which is 146. But you will notice that they do have similar courses to the IT programs, okay? Exactly the same. Okay? So there's no difference. It's funny because the technical working groups that created these PSGs, they would actually overlap with one another. That one member of this technical working group is also a member of the other technical working group, and the overlap can be quite significant. We're not talking of just simply 1 or 2 common people. We're talking of perhaps 6 or 7 of them being involved in all of these task force. So, of course, with some differences on the fringes, but point here is that it's practically the same. It's coming from the same source. This would be the EMC courses, okay? 27 of them. Now, notice in the descriptive titles, you probably might see them, okay? They might be familiar to some of you, okay? So, which we've seen already when we were doing the mapping for DepEd and for the TESDA specializations. So this one would be for game development. Again, you will see that there are certain courses that are already indicated in DepEd or the TESDA courses. Okay, digital animation, same idea. Now for the multimedia program, for the multimedia arts program, okay, this is their core courses. Now, they're not IT. They don't have their foundations in IT. The technical working group for this program is evidently different. But if you take a look at their major courses or their professional courses, a lot of them would have some similarities with the previous one, with EMC. Okay. Now, when we try to map them out, now this is just an attempt for me to map them out, but if you take a look at the TESDA training courses that were orphaned by DepEd, okay, and you look at the CHED equivalent courses, it's not an exact mapping. So admittedly, if I try to see and compare them, it's not exactly the same. Like for example, 2D animation, there is a course, a 3-unit course in any of the programs there. It's 3 units, but in the CHED world, 1 unit is actually equivalent to 18 hours of contact. Okay, so that would translate to 54 hours total for a 3-unit course. In the case of 2D animation, it's like 968, okay, for TESDA. So the difference is quite glaring. Now, are we saying that the CHED programs are shortchanging those students attending those programs? No, not necessarily. Admittedly, this is just a pale attempt to try to match them. But the point of this table, if you may, is that it's quite possible for us to identify training courses in TESDA that have their equivalent in CHED or in higher education. So I guess one of the questions that might pop up in your heads would be which ones would be more credible, or which ones would be the more comprehensive program, if you will, right? Well, it's going to be up for debate. But generally, I mean, the point there is that if DepEd is not going to have its own equivalent for these TESDA courses, chances are CHED would have. And definitely how we're trying to identify or define what is really required for these types of skills, it can vary. CHED would have their own understanding of certain things. TESDA might have their own understanding of things. And when I say CHED, it's not necessarily CHED, the regulator, but even the institutions themselves, though the colleges and universities delivering these programs, it's going to be very different. Okay. Now, I want to take this picture because this was a picture of a memorandum of agreement between CHED and perhaps the largest local organization in the Philippines for IT, or IBPAP. Okay. The point here I want to point out is that this was done in 2022. Okay. Very recent. The whole idea was to help precisely with the skills mismatch problem, help the higher education sector be updated with the things, anything to do with IT. Now, you'll probably notice some familiar personalities here. There, okay, Popoy de Vera, as you can see, third from the left. Okay, the one beside him to his left, or the third person from the right, is Jack Madrid. Okay. Who's the head of IBPAP, the Association of IT and BPO Companies in the Philippines. Okay. But this person may not be that popular, but to the right of Popoy de Vera is actually Norman Lee, who's been one of the strong advocates when it comes to game development, okay, in the Philippines. Okay, and he's been part of the CHED committees as far as I can recall. And later on, when you see the PSFs, you'll see that, if you recall the snapshot that I shared many slides ago, you've noticed that there was an existing, or there is now an existing PSF for game development. Okay, and that's mainly based to the efforts of Norman Lee and the Association of Game Developers in the Philippines. Okay, now I just want to do a postscript regarding data science, because this is something that has been recently discussed at the CHED World end of last year, and I was part of that meeting of large. It's a fairly large group wherein they discuss the draft PSGs for data science. Take note that there is no current regulation in effect for data science, for analytics. And it's quite funny because when you try to compare the experiences of the universities, they have different starting points. Okay. In fact, not all of them would offer data science. Some of them would call them analytics, business analytics. Okay. And some of them would just simply improve their statistics. Now, this is quite interesting because we can see how the skills have evolved, wherein it's now actually borrowing competencies from distinct fields such as IT, mathematics, and statistics. Okay. And it's funny because or perhaps not to use the word funny, but it's quite amusing that the formulation of the PSG, they haven't promulgated this, they haven't passed this, but the promulgation of the PSG, the starting point was actually they had to coordinate with, I think, 4 technical working groups that don't necessarily overlap. Okay? Unlike in the earlier programs in IT, in EMC, okay, there are some overlaps there, but in this case, it's not. Now, the caveat here is that the lead technical working group is actually the one in IT. Okay, so we'll see what's going to happen here, but I just want to point this out. The CHED is already looking into this for data science, okay, and formulating the standards on schools delivering data science programs in the Philippines. Now I'm going to move away now from the regulatory space to what we're really doing now in the free market side or in the side of the industry. Well, when we talk about the skills framework, the Philippine skills framework, well, DTI uh, in one of their agencies, okay, helped formulate the skills framework. Okay, and they've actually have 6 sectors now with defined frameworks. Okay, they're listed there. Okay, and it's quite comprehensive. If you take a look at them, you can easily access them. They're downloadable. Okay, but as far as I understand, at least when I saw it, okay, it's just 6 sectors. Okay, it was already 6 sectors last year. Up to now, it's still 6 sectors. But what I've heard from the grapevine is that for IT, that's already in the works. I was talking with some people in DTI about it, and I've been made aware of certain attempts by DICT to actually try to solicit help from institutions to help formulate the skills framework. Now, the idea there is that they want to do a PSF also for the ICT sector, and the plan is to leverage the Singapore skills framework. Now, as far as methodology goes, if that is what's required by DICT, sometimes these people involved in the crafting of the skills framework, they'll just probably have to follow it. But of course, if you want to have an open mind about these things, it doesn't necessarily have to be the Singapore skills framework. But be that as it may, we can take a look at what the Singapore skills framework would have. Now, for specific for ICT, Skills Future actually identified 8 career pathways. Okay, they're listed here: cybersecurity, operations and support, infrastructure, data and artificial intelligence, strategy and governance, software and applications, sales and marketing, and product development. 6 career pathways, which actually represents 128 job roles. So as far as Singapore goes, as far as Singapore and ICT goes, they have codified 128 job roles. That's a lot. Compare that with 6 sectors, okay, that are not related with one another by the PSF, okay. That's quite glaring. We are actually really falling behind as far as the skills framework goes. And when you take a look at the hard and soft skills, okay, in the ICT framework of the SSF, or the Singapore Skills Framework, you have 15 categories. I'm going to post them here. Just take a look. You'll notice that these are the things that you'd expect, okay, an IT professional to actually have when they do IT work here in the Philippines or elsewhere. But I want you to compare it now with the standards that are promulgated by our regulators, by DepEd, by TESDA, and by CHED. Okay, how many of this is actually codified in those standards? Now, granted, they're a bit dated, but I think that's the point. They're quite dated. Okay, and if you try to calculate or notice the delta between this one and what we have currently promulgated or currently enforced, it's a big gap. It's a big delta to speak of. Now, this is the core or the critical core skills or the enabling competencies and skills, right? Here, so they have defined 3 general categories: thinking critically, interacting with others, and staying relevant. And there are specific skills in each of those categories. Okay, quite interesting. You can probably map it to the list of skills that are required for the 21st century. So you probably have heard of it. Okay, you'll notice that a lot of these skills listed here, they also can be matched there. Now, what are the insights from all of this, from this experience with the skills mismatch problem investigation for ICT in the Philippines? Well, skills development in the Philippines, it's regulation oriented. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't want to give a blanket answer. What I can tell you that as far as IT goes, being regulation oriented does not put us in a very competitive position relative to other countries. At least that's what I've noticed. And Unfortunately, we will be criticized. We will be criticized by other countries, by other nations on our seeming backward standards. Okay? I'm sorry if I have to be this blunt, but that's what the facts tell us now. Okay. Now, specifically, DepEd, admittedly, they're in the discovery stages, but that's not their job in the sense that they also have to deal with the general holistic formation of the students under 18 years old. Okay? So for them to actually work on the ICT sector, the skills needed for that, etc., they're still at discovery stages, but you have to give them credit. They are recognizing that. Okay? And they've put out some standards, which unfortunately not a lot of schools are actually picking up or applying, maybe because these schools don't have the skills, which is something that we've also discovered in our programs as part of my research as well, right? SHED, well, definitely they need to update the PSGs. I think that's the most glaring thing. I don't want to be too critical about them. There are a lot of concerns right now in higher education, okay? And of course, while we say that there are a lot of issues, of course, you'd still want to say that this is also important, so on and so forth. But needless to say, at this point, there is really a need to update the PSGs or the standards for higher education. And for TESDA, again, this is no shame. Okay, the idea of promoting technical vocation education and training as a first-class pathway. In fact, it's quite funny because you do have well-established, mature frameworks in other developed countries when it comes to technical vocational education. And there's no shame there. Here in the Philippines, there's this, while I say this anecdotally, right, there's this stigma that if you go through a tech voc program, it's as if you are second class, you are lower level. And unfortunately, there seems to be some basis because the only way for someone to get probably higher salary is if they have a bachelor's degree. Okay, now that's a fact. Okay, now whether that fact is justified or not, that's something that we can probably debate. Okay, in another forum. But really, I think the opportunity that's potentially lost here is, we have to appreciate technical vocational education and training as an alternative that is viable, that is promotable, that is something to be proud of. Okay, again, developed countries have mature tech voc programs, tech voc frameworks. Okay, and there's no shame there. Okay, now industry-wide coordination is a bit scattered. Okay, as far as private sector goes, can be a bit ad hoc. Okay, the fact remains we still don't have a Philippine skills framework for ICT. Eventually, we'll have one. Okay, and I hope it would really spur a lot of developments and changes and improvements in that area. But I'm just stating fact. I'm not criticizing. I'm not being judgmental about the people involved behind all these things, right? Now, lastly, to wrap up my presentation, okay, what do we do now moving forward? Okay, and I termed this section the skills to move forward. Okay, we're talking about skills mismatch. Well, we need to have the skills to actually solve the skills mismatch problem. So how do we move forward now? Well, what are the opportunities? Well, for example, TVET or Tech Voc Education and Training is an underrated competitive advantage available to the Philippines. It's there. The standards are there. Everything is there. You've noticed even the dates on when these standards are promulgated. They've been there for a few years already. And nobody's really picking that up and using that as an opportunity to help the country. Okay. Again, I have no criticisms with parents who'd like their children to actually get a college degree. The fact of the matter is that that's how the industry works, right? They will put as minimum qualification a bachelor's degree for something that perhaps it can be done by anybody who doesn't really need to have a bachelor's degree. Okay, but that's the reality we're faced now. And yet, okay, all these opportunities, they're there. They're available already in the Philippines. We don't really have to work too much to actually do it, right? But it's already there. It's developed. Something has been designed already. Now, next, I'm trying to suggest what I would call a new principle of trifocalization, where it has to be an interaction of communities, government, specifically the regulator, and the industry. What would make this opportunity a bit more enticing or more lucrative, perhaps, is the fact that we need these three players. You remove one of them, you're gonna have some difficulties. For example, you remove the community, you just focus on developing the regulator in the industry. Okay. Do you think you'll be able to get the supply that you need to fulfill your skills mismatch? Probably not. Remove the industry. Now you just focus on the schools, the communities, and then the regulator that comes up with the standards. Okay. It's possible that the industry won't really need them because perhaps the standards that were formulated were misaligned. And lastly, removing the regulator, just going direct to the communities and the industry, training all of these things. Well, we are losing out a lot on efficient possibilities, efficient ways of communicating. There are possible dangers with people who aren't really qualified, but they say they're qualified, right? So that's a reason why we have regulators in the first place, especially in the education industry, right? Especially if the training that's required to be hired in a particular role is actually an expensive type of program. Okay, well, you need a regulator to keep everything safe. So in effect, we need these three. We can't remove any one of them. We need these three. Any attempt for us to solve the skills mismatch problem, okay, you'd need these three. Specific to the ICT industry, my comment here would be, well, okay, it's good that the industry, the private sector is dealing with the regulator, like in the case of IBPAP and CHED, but at some point in time, you'll have to go with the schools. You'll need to be able to help the schools. You need to be able to help equip teachers, okay, faculty, rather than, sitting back and say, okay, here are papers, just read them, try to implement. No. The reality of the situation is that, even some educational institutions lack teachers. So you can't really expect these institutions to just run whatever updating program that you need to do. Okay. So, but without the communities involved, okay, the chances of success would be limited. Okay. But I'm sure a lot of you get the idea why these three players are important. And lastly, if you want to be a little bit more concrete with the possibilities, some of us criticize a lot about the K-12 program, it's quite excessive, so on and so forth. That's a debate for another day. But what I can tell you is that they're not all bad. Okay? We just need to focus our attention on trying to elevate more senior high schools. Okay, grade 11, grade 12. Okay, more TechVoc institutions or TVET centers. Okay, specific for IT in my case. Okay, there's a lot of good there. In fact, one of the researches that I'm doing, one of the research projects that I'm doing is I'm helping certain DepEd divisions actually come up with their own ICT school for their own specific division. Okay, it's a tall order, but as long as we have the community, in this case, the division, you have the regulator, which is DepEd. Now I bring in the industry. I bring in the talent who will actually help not just train the teachers, but even be the teachers themselves. And maybe try to get some sort of concession, perhaps, from the regulator to allow these teachers to teach, right? You're not really requiring to have a license for that. Just an example, okay? But I see that these are opportunities, and eventually, if we are able to showcase more successes, more good results from these efforts, others will pick it up, and then we'll continue the success, the good thing that's being done by them. And we want these senior high schools and TVET centers. No, we're not there for the volume. We need them to be supported by the higher education institutions, and I think that's a caveat there. You want these institutions to be well supported as well by higher education institutions. Okay. Now, it's a little bit challenging because, especially for the private colleges and universities, their viability is also dictated by people coming in to colleges and universities. So trying to help them promote a program that will not require them to go to college or to the university is, anticlimactic, right? I mean, it's unheard of, perhaps. It's weird, perhaps, but still, you know, we can't really support these senior high schools, these TVET centers, if you have the colleges and universities also supporting them. At the same time, with industry partners, you still need the industry partners here. So that is how we can concretize the trifocalization, the new principle of trifocalization, at least in the case of IT. With that, I'm done with my long presentation, with my long, I wouldn't say lecture, but a presentation, a review of what we're doing to try to solve the skills mismatch problem in the Philippines. And I turn the back over to Margie. Maybe if there are some questions from the participants.